Thank you. Thanks, everyone, for being here today. So we're starting now our next panel, Women's Rights, Gender, and Sexuality. We've got here with us Dr. Prudence Flowers, Senior Lecturer in U.S. History at the College of Humanities, Arts, and Social Sciences. Her work focuses on social movement activism, modern conservatism, medicine and public health, and the politics of gender, sexuality, and the body. She has strong interest in abortion and family planning, both as elements of healthcare and as triggers for polarizing social movement formation. We also have here to my left Dr. Leoni Connah, who is a lecturer in international relations at Flinders, College of Business, Government and Law. Her ongoing research explores the changing nature of the conflict in Kashmir in recent years and the impact this has had for regional South Asian security, as well as human security. Dr. Connah holds broader research interests in post-colonial politics, human rights, feminism, and conflict studies. So we'll do this a little differently, so I will just hand over to Leoni and Prudence.
Thanks, Rod, for the nice introduction. So today we're going to do it a slightly different way to the previous panels. We're going to have a conversation. We did have a kind of a plan, and we were going to start with the role of emotions and joy and hope and optimism. That's gone out the window for now, and we'll kind of talk about why, but that's how this conversation is going to go.
Yeah, so we were initially planning to talk about this, about how each candidate has run their campaign and the kind of ways in which they've made specific appeals, gendered appeals, really highly gendered appeals, and then kind of move into talking in quite concrete policy ways about what each potential candidate might look like if elected. Did you want to talk a little bit about how they've run the campaigns?
Yeah, so we was talking about like the difference between a positive campaign and a slightly negative campaign, or very negative campaign. So for Harris, it's been very much about this sort of, in old school terms, equality feminism, not difference feminism. So instead of tapping into this notion of being the first woman president, she's actually not done that, and it's been for very good reason. So she's very much avoided divisiveness. She's very much avoided being termed as the DEI hire. She's very much avoided all of the sort of negative tropes that Trump has thrown at her. And it's been done in a way to invoke emotions like joy and hope and optimism, which we're still clinging on to. So this has had a wider appeal than, say, for example, Hillary Clinton campaign might have had in the past, because she's not gone down that divisive route, which has then given a more appeal to, say, Republican women's vote, as an example, and it's just been a slightly different tactic altogether. Whereas Trump, on the other hand, we know has gone down a very negative for men only narrative. He's very much tapped into the misogynist manosphere and kind of evoked emotions of difference and emotions that isolate not just women but other audiences all over the States. So what happened here is we've got two completely different campaigns, one very much for the people and for everyone, and one very much for himself, which is Trump. So that's how we've been understanding the characteristics. And in terms of the language that's been used as well, we've seen with Harris it has been overwhelmingly positive, or tried to be overwhelmingly positive as and when possible. Whereas we know for Trump it has been very reactionary, it's been very angry, it's been very violent and abrasive. So what we've tried to think through is why that's been the case, and then what sort of consequence that might have for women and women's rights.
Yeah, and I think I'm just going to jump into a point that we didn't discuss before, but this is going to be a small rant. It was predicted that this would be an election decided by female voters. That was what a lot of the pundits thought, that there was record female enrolment, record women doing early voting, record women turning out at polling places and voting, often by like 4-to-1, 8-to-1 ratios. And if the election is as narrow as it looks, or if Trump wins, I think what we have to grapple with is the fact that that means women voted in large numbers for Trump. And I want to specifically identify the fact that we know that white women have traditionally voted for Republicans. And I think it's one of those things that gets lost in a lot of the ways that we talk about women's rights, is that we assume that there's a universal woman who votes for the Democrats and votes around feminist issues. But actually, historically, since 1964, only twice have white women voted for the Democratic candidate. The last time was in 1996. So in 2016 and in 2020, Trump won majorities of white female voters. In fact, he increased his share in 2020. And I think what's quite challenging is that many people assumed that white women in this election were going to break that pattern and were going to vote for Harris, given the huge amount of anger there seemed to be around issues to do with abortion access in particular. And I think one of the things that people like Leoni and myself will have to grapple with going forward is how to make sense of both the very documented anger around abortion bans, which is one of the big consequences of Trump's politics, with the fact that at the moment it looks like white women continue to be quite evenly split, or perhaps will continue to lean towards Republicans.
Yeah, and it's just trying to think, why would white women vote for Trump? Like, what is the reason behind it?
Race.
Yes. So obviously we said we didn't really want to go, or in fact Harris hasn't quite gone into identity politics in terms of gender as such, but it does play a huge role when we think through race. And white women don't want to vote for the first woman of colour to be president of the United States. So we have to question why that is, and we have to offer a critique of that to try and understand how could anybody overcome such a big obstacle in the likes of women's rights over race, because that's what it's.
Although, to be clear, white women didn't want to vote for Hillary Clinton either.
No.
So, maybe white women just tend to vote the way white men vote, and predominantly white men have voted Republican by and large. So I think what we're seeing here is solidarity around race and an inability to kind of identify across boundaries at this moment in time. And I think given the really, really stark policy differences that these candidates represent, it's worth kind of unpacking just what this potentially means on the ground. Do you want me to? Yeah, okay. So I've mentioned abortion. So Trump has essentially been the president who proudly helped see the end of the constitutional right to abortion in the US. He appointed the 3 judges that made up the majority that ended legal abortion in 2022. He was campaigning as, quote unquote, the most pro-life candidate ever. So this is a big part of his identity. He's hedged his bets a lot on abortion in this campaign, which if anyone is interested, we can talk about in questions. But it's pretty clear that a Trump victory will mean significant further erosion of abortion rights and access. Regardless of anything else he said, we will see further attacks on abortion rights at the federal level if he wins. So abortion rights are going to continue to be decimated if Trump wins. It's also worth noting that this campaign has been extraordinarily transphobic, like in an unprecedented way. The Trump campaign has spent hundreds of millions of dollars running anti-trans advertisements in swing states, not because they think it's going to be a huge vote getter, but just because they think it will energize certain voters. So trans people make up about 0.5% of the US population. There was some kind of estimate that he had spent about $200 per trans person in the country on anti-trans advertising. And the point of that is really just to kind of be polarizing and to, hew what we would call a kind of culture wars politics of division. So we know from Trump's time in the White House that if he is elected, this will be devastating, not just for trans people, but for LGBTQI plus people. When he was his 4 years in the White House, he voted he lobbied against key Equality Act measures that tried to ban discrimination against LGBTQI plus people. He got the Department of Education to roll back various protections for trans students. There was a tax on trans people in the military. And in the UN, the US allied itself with groups that others called the quote-unquote axis of medievals because of their attitudes on abortion and sexuality issues. So we know that if Trump wins, the US will again align itself with people like Russia and Saudi Arabia on issues to do with gender and sexuality. And this is just a known thing. This is exactly what happened last time. So again, if Trump wins, this will have really devastating and significant consequences around issues to do with reproduction and issues to do with sexuality. And the other thing I want to note is that this time in the campaign, through these kind of gestures to the manosphere that Leoni's pointed to, there's been this kind of really interesting leaning into a very specific vision of family and masculinity. And J.D. Vance, whom many of you may know and kind of love in a meme-ified way because he's really dominated online spaces in that format, represent a vision of family that is much more overtly patriarchal, heterosexual, and kind of anti-divorce, anti-single mothers, anti-women working than has previously been the norm. So a lot of the kind of framing in Project 2025, which is the document that's often seen as the kind of master list of Trump ambitions, the first point in that is about the need to restore family. beyond economy, beyond everything else. And if you go through the document, family is very much defined as headed by a male working like patriarch. There's a lot of attacks in there on divorce, on single mothers, on working women undermining male authority. It's a very specific vision of family and family formation that is not reflected in how people currently live. It's certainly not even reflected in Trump's own life with his multiple divorces and children with multiple women and his multiple affairs. But this is the kind of politics that he is kind of projecting out into the world. And it's actually more pronounced in its culture wars division than it was even in 2016.
Yeah, and just on the back of that, what that then leads to is this kind of restoring of entitlement, an entitlement in a way that is very masculine and trying to restore this kind of romanticized version of the patriarchy. And that's exactly what Trump's trying to do. And what happens if Trump comes in, is not only is it a threat to women's reproductive rights in terms of abortion and IVF and access to contraception and other major healthcare initiatives, but also just this reinforcement of gender stereotypes, which is hugely problematic. We don't want to rewind, I don't even want to say 100 years, however long it might rewind, perceptions of women, but this very notion of what family looks like, the references to Harris as being the childless cat lady, the attacks on her biological family and children, are just really problematic, and it does bring that back to how women are then going to be perceived in society. So it's not just about, well, it is just about access in terms of policy and healthcare, but also just wider stereotypes and what that means for women's everyday lives and what they are going to face in the home, but also going to work, school, education, all of the other things that come with living in a society where men believe and feel that they are entitled to things because of misogynistic leader, which would be Trump.
Yeah, and I mean, I think the misogyny has been, if it's possible, more overt than it was in the Clinton campaign. Here we can think about, Elon Musk's America PAC ran a tweet that it then took down, which said, Kamala is a C word. And the implication, which we can all read, was like, oh, no, we mean communist. But that's not what people took from it. And it was deleted quite quickly. You've had J.D. Vance referring to Kamala as garbage that needs to be taken out in the last few days. Like, there's this kind of rhetoric that has been extraordinarily misogynistic and vitriolic in these last days of the campaign. And even today, key Trump kind of figures and key figures on the right were tweeting, men, you need to get out to vote. Get every man you know out to vote. Like, Trump is actively courting a very specific type of aggrieved male voter. I think what's deeply alarming is that huge numbers of women seem to have been persuaded by these kinds of appeals as well.
Yeah, and just on the back of that, in terms of threats and security to women's safety, can't go unnoticed either. These sorts of attitudes you might brush off as being, I don't know, quite not very harmful, or it's just they don't really mean what they say, but this does encourage violence against women. We know that misogynistic attitudes and these beliefs do result in women being the main targets, and what can't go unnoticed as well is that immigrant and particularly black women in America will be extremely vulnerable under Trump. That's not an understatement at all, especially around the strategy on gender equity and equality being under threat around Trump. It does put women, especially immigrant women and women of colour, under extreme pressures, but also they're really at risk with the Trump administration.
I think we're kind of happy to open it up for questions now, if people have things that they'd like to ask or say.
Excellent. Any questions from the public? Up here in the front.
Sorry.
This one's probably a little bit of a trigger warning with this question. How do you think, with the very public and known deaths due to a lack of abortion care, will have swayed many of the women, and also with Kamala's ad of women voting in secret against their husbands and the vitriolic attack against that, how do you think that's affected a lot of these young, possibly trapped in unhealthy relationships, women?
I don't think it's affected them very much at all. Like, I think, again, people were predicting, given the huge turnout from women voters and the huge enrolments of women voters and women being front and centre today as well, that would mean a really clear swing towards Kamala, and that's not what we're seeing happen on the ground. I want to make a point here. So we now know, I believe, of 4 women who have died because of the abortion bans that have been in place, all of whom experienced a miscarriage that then a hospital wouldn't treat because out of fear, essentially, that the hospital, the doctors would be prosecuted. It's worth noting that, and I've forgotten the specific year, but in the early 2010s in Ireland, there was an Indian immigrant woman who had exactly the same experience and who died of a septic abortion. And that event galvanised the repeal of Ireland's draconian abortion laws. In America, it's been treated as business as usual. Like, oh, well, people have died. That's just hospitals not really understanding the policy. In other countries, one death triggered huge movements and a political will to revisit abortion bans. Unfortunately, I don't think that the revelations around those deaths have had anywhere near the kind of impact that we would have expected them to. And in terms of the advertising encouraging people to vote in secret, I think it was interesting how angry so many key Trump allies became around this idea that women could vote in ways that were counter to their husbands' beliefs. And I think it's really disturbing that you saw a lot of commentary from people like Charlie Kirk and others about like that being equivalent to an affair, or that betraying the sanctity of marriage. And, you've seen a few key Trump allies joke about, oh, this is why we shouldn't have given women the vote. Like, there's really disturbing rhetoric just being normalised, swirling around constantly.
Just a question, because I'm just going to base this off a saying, when America sneezes, Australia gets a cold. What do you think the effect of these lack of rights or limiting of women's rights is going to have an effect in Australia if Trump is to win?
I can just keep going. So I think we've already seen the effect of the end of Roe v. Wade. So in South Australia, we recently had a very narrowly defeated piece of abortion legislation just about a month ago. In Queensland, it was a major issue in that election. In fact, it was only the kind of revelation that there was likely to be a conscience vote on abortion in Queensland that narrowed the kind of LNP projected victory. I think it's really notable that only, I think yesterday, Peter Dutton apparently was haranguing his, the party room saying, do not talk about abortion. This issue is losing us votes. So I think on the one hand, what happens in the US will have consequences here. I think if Trump is re-elected, it will absolutely embolden every anti-abortion politician. And we have lots in South Australia at the state and federal level. We have lots nationwide. It will absolutely embolden them to think that this is not a vote-losing issue, no matter what Peter Dutton says.
We have several, there's in the back as well, but there's several here in the front. If you can raise your hands, then...
Thanks for the presentation. It's really interesting. You've both talked about how white American women typically tend to vote Republican. How do you kind of envision or think the Democratic Party could win back those votes? Or do you think it's more of a systemic issue to do with things like men controlling their wives' votes and things like that? And therefore, it's more of like a long-term issue rather than the Democratic Party necessarily taking different stances?
Currently right now, as in what's going to happen, it really very much depends on the 3 states. So I don't think it's a short-term problem that is going to be fixed by the Democratic women's vote right now. So I would say if it was to pick, it would be a longer-term issue in which a lot of things would have to change around gender stereotypes, but also this emboldening of white powerful men that are reinforcing misogynistic views. So if I was to short answer, it would be a longer term issue. I don't think it's necessarily a party specific issue, but
I think we have to stop thinking about white women as victims. I think to assume that these white women are voting only because their husbands make them do it and not because they don't benefit in meaningful ways from the power afforded to them, I think it's a really challenging thing, but we need to think about that because in some ways, this is a decades-long issue. Again, 1964 and 1996 are the only times white women have voted in the majority for the Democrats, like in the last 50 years. I think that really goes under-remarked upon. Again, even in the kind of Trump context, everyone focused on working class voters, but no one kind of focused on the fact that actually white middle class and upper class voters voted in large numbers for him in 2016. So I think really I don't know how you deal with that. I think Trump does really well at boosting a politics of grievance. So grievance against immigrants, grievance against trans athletes taking your daughter's spot in school. Like, there's been all this advertising about that. Grievance which makes people feel like something's being taken from them. I think it's really distressing that Kamala Harris, who ran on this campaign that was about, you know, we have so much that unites us, this is the promise of America, these are all the things that we should feel proud of, that does not appear to have been a message that got through to at least, you know, 48, 49% of the population.
Yeah, and just on another point, I just want to say as well that it's not always just about the kind of white women's vote. We know that Harris has lost a considerable number potentially of votes because of the situation in Gaza. So pro-Palestinian groups and women who are obviously in support of Palestine have not voted for Harris, thinking it would be a strategic vote to vote for a third party because of the politics and because of the fact that, you know, likely potentially with a Harris government, it wouldn't be a simple peaceful situation and that she's going to solve the ongoing genocide in Gaza overnight. So that's also had an influence on the outcome of this election and the vote towards Harris that isn't just about women, but also women of colour, women who are supporting Palestine and other complicated issues, that it's not that simple to say, oh, we've got women of colour voting for Harris and then white women not. We know that it's more complicated than that, which then also makes it hard to predict future voting patterns of women if, you know, foreign policy issues and other kind of global issues are also having an influence on the vote.
Although I just want to add to that again, I would view Jill Stein as someone who gets away with advancing a kind of, oh, I'm just a wishy-washy progressive voice out here making a stand. And she's been really actively presenting herself as someone that, you know, the undecided movement can vote for. She has very clear connections to, like, essentially Trump and Russia. She's nominated her vice presidential candidate as explicitly anti-trans. You know, she's made pro-Israel comments, but she presents herself in the media as someone who is a kind of innocent figure standing up to establishment politics. And that has not been interrogated, despite her being this kind of ongoing figure in the American political landscape. I think whereas like Ralph Nader in 2000 was at least a genuine third-party candidate, Jill Stein seems to be functioning very much as a conscious spoiler. Anyway.
Next question.
Yeah, there's another one.
Yeah. Oh, I can speak now. That's okay. I was just wanting to ask about if you expect the behaviours and the rhetoric that Trump and JD Vance like to shout everywhere, how that will trickle down into Australia in regards to not only women's rights but gender and sexuality. And separately, I would also like some words of maybe wisdom and hope that you guys can give how we can everyone in this room can act to preserve especially abortion rights. And then it is a third question. Sorry guys. But do you think women can take up the space as populists, because we are seeing a populist in America, and is that a space that women can have?
If you mean can women be right-wing reactionaries, absolutely. Any woman can get up there and give conservative talking points and get themselves on Sky News and get themselves a platform if they want to. In fact, conservatives love right-wing women. I'm making a joke because I don't think that's what you meant. But Trump's populism and the populism that works is right-wing populism. And I think we don't see many successful models in the West of left-wing populism. But I'll let you.
No, I would agree. I mean, in terms of what that might look like trickle-down-wise, it very much depends, you know, the way that we see the influence of the right wing and these sorts of views come into hold office or take up prominent space on the global stage does have an influence everywhere, not just in Australia. So it does embolden men and it does embolden these attitudes against women that will prevent them from leaving a toxic relationship or prevent them from going out and to vote, especially next year with the Australian elections. So it can't go underestimated that this will have a negative impact on women everywhere if Trump is to come into power. But in terms of optimism and hope, which we come back full circle, that we said was going to do at the beginning.
Some more negative stuff?
Yeah, more negative stuff.
Okay. So you asked also about the trickle-down impact on sexuality. I think this is a really, really live issue for us to be looking at, because I think that there's much more uniform support for abortion rights in Australia than there is to do with support for trans and gendered non-diverse people. You know, abortion rights have really high, consistent rates of pro-choice majorities in this country. I think actually trans people have been subject to really significant attacks pretty much since this marriage equality vote. And I think they're the kind of opening wedge for attacks against LGBTQI rights more broadly. So I think that is something that people need to be very aware of. And certainly we already have seen at the state and territory level people beginning to propose, you know, legislative inquiries and whatnot that would investigate things like, you know, the kind of medical treatment of trans youth, or, you know, push back against the very recently passed conversion therapy bans. There's already complaints around that. So I think that there are very real areas where those issues will be under attack. In this country, I think trans people will be at the forefront of those attacks, and they need the greatest solidarity. So hope.
Hope. What does that mean? I don't know. In terms of, if we go to Trump's actual power.
Hope in Australia.
Oh, hope in Australia. Oh, right. Okay. So I was struggling to find a hopeful US point. Hope in Australia is that, and when you asked about can women occupy spaces of power and influence, I think we can. I think that we shouldn't lose sight of that and lose sight of that if Trump gets in, the world is going to end. It is easy to emphasise that it's easy to get caught up in the negative, but I think we do have to remain hopeful that we are in Australia and we're not in the US. So there is some weight in that.
I think in terms of hope, people need to be really engaged with what is happening politically here. And this sounds like the most boring thing I can say because, to be honest, Australian politics is incredibly dull and not sexy like this. But actually, this is the thing that we should all be focusing on and paying intense attention to. You know, in the last 2 years in South Australia, there has been a very conscious takeover of the Liberal Party at the branch level being orchestrated by Senator Alex Antic, and it's a Conservative takeover. The same thing's been happening in Victoria. These are all things that are known and they get reported on, but I don't think they sink through to the public. And so then you have something like the recent abortion vote and people are really shocked, like, how is it this close? And that's because the makeup of the Liberal Party, for example, has been changing. And that's been happening because people don't pay attention to what is happening politically. So I think we need to be focused on politics and engaged in politics in a way that I think Australians generally are not. And I think, again, it's very easy to focus on the federal level, but in Australia, a lot of the kind of decisions that will meaningfully impact our lives are going to be happening at the state level. And so state elections, you know, there's a by-election right now in Black. There's lots of discussions that we should be having about, you know, who these candidates are, what views do they have on a range of issues. The Murdoch press in this state doesn't do that work for us. So we, like Queensland, have one newspaper run by the Murdoch press, and it's PAP. I think we can all agree. So we have to find ways to engage with that forum, but also with other ways of gathering knowledge. So there's InDaily, there's News Daily, there's ABC Australia, there's The Guardian Australia, but also we can't give up on The Advertiser because it is a key place where people get information. So there has to be a kind of pressure on multiple fronts and constant engagement. The comment, the price of freedom is eternal vigilance. What's happening here, I think, should be a sign for all of us that, you know, you cannot take anything for granted. And I think in Australia, we need to focus on our own backyard and perhaps less on what's happening in the US.
With the presidential election going on right now, and currently the presidential election doesn't look so good, I guess. But more importantly, which is the presidential election actually that important in comparison to other, not just like other elections, but things like business changes in the business of society, things like Elon Musk taking over Twitter, for example, on how gender and sexuality can actually be discussed in this situation? Because like if a Trump win can happen, and it is, but if Trump wins and he might not win the House, then he might not be able to push any policies that actually attack trans people or women or working women or whatnot.
Do you want to? Oh, you're ready.
So. You're very right to point to the fact that Congress matters a huge amount in this moment. In some ways, the drama of the election always gives Congress short shrift, so I'm very glad that there's a panel on the House and the Senate races next. It does, most commentators assume that the Democrats are going to lose the Senate. That was kind of known. It was such a narrow hold. But it's also worth noting that even when they had a majority, 2 of those Democrats were so conservative in their voting patterns that it didn't really matter. So Trump can theoretically still make alliances with conservative Democrats to get stuff through if he needs to. And I just want to flag that. Whereas Republicans have really voted en masse really since the Tea Party days, they voted as a unified bloc. Democrats vote in a more muddied way, and that is a disadvantage. So Trump can still push through various agenda things with Congress if he can get enough Democrats on board. The other thing is he loves executive orders. If we can think back when he was president, he was issuing so many of them. So he can make changes that then have to be contested through the courts, and that's very destabilising as well. To your point about the kind of broader context for these rights, I think that's a really important thing. Even if Harris wins, for example, Elon Musk still owns Twitter, where he has been producing huge amounts of misinformation all election cycle and is extraordinarily transphobic, yet has a trans child. There's all this stuff that goes on outside government that really shapes the way that people understand and experience their world. And the US, largely because of their kind of free speech provisions in the First Amendment, are very loath to intervene in a lot of that kind of rhetoric and expression.
And also just on that, internationally, it very much depends on other countries as well. So if Trump was to come in and he does make these sort of unholy alliances that he's got, say, for example, in the United Nations, where he's trying to push against any sort of LGBTQ plus language being used in the UN, but also being used in other spaces, then it's not just about the domestic either. It does have that broader influence and broader implications for how people are treated around the world. And that is problematic, because if you've got allies, good and bad, or mostly bad, on these issues, then it's not just about the US, it's not just about Australia, it's about other countries around the world kind of forming this unholy coalition to clamp down on the rights of trans people, but other people as well.
We have another question here in the front.
Thank you. This is just to confirm a point that you made about the importance of the state level and even below election level politics. One of the reasons we're in this situation is that the Republicans, and this is maybe an example of an American practice being taken up here, the Republicans played a long game. They got control of a lot of state legislatures and governorships, which in the US, unlike here, controlled districting, control voting practices, control voting access, control voting methods, registration. And so by controlling it at that lower level, they were able to control it indirectly aspects of the federal election. They're finding, for example, in some places, because young people are unused to signing their names a lot, their signatures aren't matching their registration. When they put in an absentee or a mail-in ballot, the signatures don't match, and so they get thrown out. So it's at that granular level of voting that the states matter in the US. Now, that is, of course, not true here. Thank goodness for the Australian Electoral Commission. Everybody give a cheer. But there are, yeah, really, truly. But there are other ways in which the states control politics at a larger level. And I think you're so right to point that out. I really value that.
And I just wanted to add one thing, like that kind of takeover at the state level, that's really solidified since 2010. So for those of you who remember the Tea Party, that influence at the federal level has been significant, but I think less remarked upon was this incredible takeover at the state level and then the gerrymandering that followed. So this is a 10, 14-year journey to this point. And again, it's something that people now, there's plenty of evidence that people in states with abortion bans don't support those bans. There's statistically all this data, and yet now they live in states with 6-week bans or total abortion bans because they cannot make their feelings known in kind of state elections.
Hi, I have a question. Is this on? Oh, cool. What do you think appealed to the conservative white woman about Trump's campaign? Because Trump's campaign was very male-focused, especially J.D. Vance is very online, very regressive male voters. Like, what do you think appealed to the white woman vote?
I mean, it's hard to say. I don't want to comment on why or how people would vote for Trump, but it might be something to do with this hyper masculinity that he projects. You know, this kind of protectionist attitude of I'm going to protect women from immigrants, I'm going to protect women from crime, I'm going to protect women from X, Y, Z, whatever other nonsense he came up with, because some women and some white women would value that. They would value this kind of warrior-like figure that Trump is projecting against, say, an immigrant figure that would be very threatening to a white woman who might be deeply racist, for example. So that would be one option. Do you want to go for another option?
I think that protection thing is an important one. You know, many of us have listened to Trump's rhetoric this campaign and thought, oh my God, this is, you know, extraordinary. But, you know, in the 2016 campaign, we had the Access Hollywood tape and we had Trump being really, really clear about his ideas around consent and bodily autonomy. And yet still white women voted in a majority way for him. So in some ways, it doesn't matter how loathsome Trump is. He's still able to attract a really sizable proportion of white women who see in him and perhaps in the Republican Party policies something that they identify with.
Thank you for your discussions so far. They've been really interesting. I apologise if the next question is maybe a little too niche and a little too online for you guys to answer. But recently, recently on TikTok, there's been a rise in very questionable influencers endorsing Donald Trump in the faces of like Jake Paul, Bryce Hall? Yeah. Do you think this is actually like a thing that could work? I couldn't imagine people on TikTok, yes, obviously we're becoming at an age where the people on TikTok are at an age to vote, but Jake Paul and Bryce Hall tend to have very young like followings. Is there an issue there in like potentially influencing these almost preteen, very teenage children to become very
Yes. Well, yes. Short answer. I mean, celebrity endorsements are not new, right? So yes, it's slightly different because you have got TikTok and you've got like a wider range of influence and slightly different target audience. But those young people become adults, and those adults will vote. So yes, it doesn't necessarily have an influence on, say, this election right now, but it will have an influence on the next election and the election after that. You know, these sorts of views and gender stereotypes and whatnot don't go away. And in fact, they're emboldened by influencers on TikTok.
Yeah, I mean, there's also, not to keep referring to various polls, but there seems to be globally in the West, but particularly in the US, it's been identified that there's a huge, what we call gender gap between Generation Z young men and young women, where young women have been identifying as much more progressive and young men are much more conservatively inclined. And in the US context, that's like support Trump versus support Harris. And that's really documented. That's why Trump, for example, has put all his eggs in the basket of going after young men through things like, oh my God, I've forgotten his name. What a blessing. Joe Rogan's podcast. It was just nice not to have that there. You know, he's going on Joe Rogan's podcast, as has Elon Musk, as has JD Vance, to get what are normally seen as low motivation voters, young white men and young men of colour, to get out and vote. So he's tapping into what's already identified, that young men are skewing more conservative. I think there's a range of kind of social issues that flow from that, and we see it in Australia as well. So why are young men skewing more conservative now when traditionally young people in general skewed more progressively? You know, there's a kind of, again, an amplification of resentment. You can also point to the creation of kind of these silos, the manosphere silos that exist online, where a lot of the kind of modelling of like what it is to be a man in online spaces is coming from these really toxic figures. I think one of the things that we had wanted to talk about in terms of hope was the way in which Tim Walz's vision of masculinity was really reassuring and kind of really offered this stark contrast to the masculinity of like Trump and Vance. And I still feel that way, that what Tim Walz was modelling throughout the campaign was a kind of different way of how to be a man and how to be an ally and how to be, you know, a Marine and a teacher and how to be a football coach, but how to still care about other people and their rights.
Yeah, I just want to jump in as well, just to say that there can be, because we were talking about role models earlier in a way, and it's kind of this assumption that we need to go back to women and women's influence, but we do have to think about the male role models that will counter and very much be a tonic masculinity to the toxic masculinity, which is what Tim Waltz and this kind of America's Dad perception has tried to do. So it's not always thinking about this kind of men versus women campaign that we've seen with Harris and Trump, because in the past it was a lot of competing masculinities, because you'd often have two male candidates running against each other. It just so happens that now we do have a slightly different situation, but we're still talking about competing masculinities. It's just a different type of masculinity altogether. But there are still male role models that can overcome and hopefully counteract the toxic masculinity that we see with Trump.
I guess to piggyback off of that, looking at trends in the United States, college educated, there's a big gap between women and men, 60% to 40%. And is this kind of a call, looking a pushback against that gap between college educated and non-college educated, and how that trend is going to continue in the next 4 years? In the next 4 years, is this going to be a continued division between that gender classism of college educated and non-college educated?
I think the simple answer is yes, because it's been an issue for a while and it will only increase further. So I'll just take it as a yes.
I agree. I'm just looking at the screen. Sorry, any more questions?
There's one in the,
Yeah.
Oh, student as well.
Oh, yeah.
There's three.
So thank you very much. So I guess this is kind of a two-pronged question, because one thing that was brought up was the manosphere. I feel like a lot of the times when we talk about the manosphere, there's a lot of focus on its effect on white men. But from at least my own personal readings, a lot of current leading figures in the manosphere are not necessarily white men. They come from various different ethnic backgrounds, and a lot of this sort of initial manosphere movements was very much African American males in the United States. At least that's from what I've seen myself so far. So I guess the question is, how is that potentially going to going forward towards America that's a lot more likely to become a majority-minority country in terms of its racial makeup? And could there be instead more of an emphasis on the sort of gender dynamic to politics going forward into the future rather than on a racial level? That's the first question. I guess the second question would be just on an economic level, how much do you think that the women voting for Trump is much more coming down to sort of an economic question and the belief of his economic competency rather than any sort of social factors?
I think just to start you off, with the two questions are actually connected, because it depends on how you understand intersectionality and the role of intersectionality in politics. So yes, you're quite right to point out that there will be men of colour that will vote for Trump, because they would rather vote for Trump than still vote for a woman. And that's nothing to do, well, it is to do with race, but it depends on where that kind of intersectionality and almost fluidity is kind of playing a role in that, which then ties to the economics, because if you've got, depending on the voter, a working class person versus, say, an upper class person, it very much depends on what influence economics has for them in terms of where they will then vote. So they might still vote for Trump if the economic priority is higher than, say, identity politics priority, which again, it's very niche and it's very specific depending on the person, but it does very much depend on how you view the role of intersectionality in politics.
I guess I just want to keep coming back to this thing of, yes, Trump is trying to peel off men of colour, and he probably has peeled off a percentage of men of colour. But in the fact that we focus so much on that, it lets go unremarked that white men are the primary people voting for him. So if he peels off 8% of African-American voters, African-American men are still voting en masse for Democrats. So there's this kind of interesting framing of who is the problem and who gets remarked upon. In terms of the manosphere, yes, certainly it's more diverse, but I think its key figures model a version of whiteness. The people who are the top, the big names that everyone would know is kind of what I was thinking about there. And even if they are not, they kind of model forms of whiteness and access to whiteness. To speak about the kind of economics thing, and again, this is what frustrates me about class, well, if it was just about people being concerned about economics, then you would have poor Black and poor Hispanic voters voting in large numbers for Trump as well, and we're not exactly seeing that. So people will often use the economy as their explanation for things, but it doesn't actually should then map more uniformly across all people from certain class backgrounds, which it has not historically done. I think I'll just leave it there because I know there are more questions.
I think we have to, unfortunately,
Could we have
Stop.
just one of the students ask a question?
One more? Okay, one more. Last question, and then.
How did it? Sorry. With the no-fault divorce, why do you think it hasn't been a huge turning point for young women and just women voters in general, and male voters as well? Because I assume most people would like to keep no-fault divorce. So why is that one of the things? Why is that one of the first things that he put on his plan?
Well, he hasn't said no to no-fault divorce, but it is worth noting that JD Vance has criticised no-fault divorce, including in contexts of abuse. Like, he's made it clear that he thinks people leave marriages too easily. These are old comments that have been unearthed. So they haven't directly gone after no-fault divorce, because divorce is really common, and Trump himself has been divorced multiple times, and white men want to be able to divorce people at will. What I think is happening there is that they kind of want to model a vision of the family which is, just to kind of emphasise, patriarchal, male-headed. So they want to talk a lot of rhetoric around what that means, so women being kind of financially submissive within relationships, but they don't actually want to change the overarching structure of society, because that wouldn't benefit them. Men initiate divorce as much as women. Divorce is kind of a fact of life. So it's more like, how is it used to connect with people and to connect with grievance? And so, there's a kind of whole subset of men who feel grievance either because they feel like they can't get a date. So you have the kind of weird incel movement, which I shouldn't bring up at the very end because we're not going to talk about it anymore. Or you have men who feel aggrieved because their wife left them. And that kind of messaging appeals to grievance. But they're not proposing any significant changes around divorce law. But I think there's this really interesting tension around how Republicans have been talking about marriage and divorce in particular. And it's quite new. Bringing up divorce and criticising divorce is not something we've seen by mainstream candidates in prior elections. And so it's a great point.
Thank you so much, Prudence. Thank you so much, Leoni. Amazing discussion. For Trump, that was one of the 7 battleground states. So it seems very clear that Trump is carrying North Carolina. The others are still too close to call, but what we can see is that Trump seems to be ahead in Georgia. Trump seems to be ahead in Michigan. Wisconsin is, Harris is ahead right now. Nevada, Harris is ahead. Arizona, they are neck to neck. What that means is that everything sort of like hinges on Pennsylvania at this stage. Pennsylvania, where Trump is ahead of Harris. Again, it's still too close to call, but given the results that we're seeing trickling down through CNN, that's where we're at. Now, the issue here is that Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania have voted as a bloc to the same candidate since 1992. All right? So we're seeing two out of the 3 leaning Trump at this stage, 1 out of the 3 leaning Harris. All 3 too close to call. So the election is as close as it gets. We will have to be watching this very carefully in the next few hours. But the sense that I get is that things are going well for Donald Trump at this stage. We'll talk about Congress during the next panel, but there as well seems that it's been in favor of Republicans. So, yes. If Michigan, Georgia, and Arizona, we will have to put the data on the map. I don't know from the top of my head, but Pennsylvania is going to be fundamental. Can you try? Is the map? Are we up to date?
New Mexico and.
So can you change Michigan?
New Mexico was never a swing vote. So.
No, yeah, New Mexico wasn't a thing.
Yeah. No.
Oh, sorry. So Michigan to Trump.
Yeah, it'll be blue. Yeah.
Pennsylvania to Trump.
It should be blue. No, it is. Yeah. It is. Yeah. New Mexico and Colorado are always or consistently blue.
in Georgia to Trump. Oh. Yeah, that's enough. We don't even have to change. Yeah, Georgia to Trump, I can tell it is enough. So you're right. Michigan, no, but you switch Pennsylvania. Can you switch Pennsylvania back? To uncalled, to not called. So there it is. If you have only Michigan and Georgia, it's not enough. It's 261. Arizona is very close. So yeah, if we start doing that, there are multiple paths for both candidates to win. But Arizona right now is literally neck to neck.
And Arizona was like under 20,000 last time. Like
Yeah, it was just starting. We can't talk about that. But again, the most clear path for everyone.
Rodrigo?
Huh?
Where's the alcohol?
Yeah. The alcohol. We can't serve. We have high school students and everything. We can serve alcohol here. We did that in 2016.
I know, Rodrigo. It was terrible though.
No, we can't do that. So that's where we stand right now. So we'll see you at 4 p.m. for the Congress panel. Thank you.